The right wing, and more accurately the far right, loves to fearmonger about terrorists coming into the countries and, killing their citizens. And it's not just here in America that we hear that rhetoric. Of course, you actually hear that in a lot of countries who have seen increased migration due to wars, climate change, etc. Now, a lot of these immigrants tend to be from the Middle East. Now, in America, we have an issue with migrants coming up from Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. It doesn't help that we supported a coup in Honduras in 2009, which is, of course, increased migration from that country to the United States. So now, a lot of these right wingers tend to warn about these immigrants that are coming in, saying that, oh, they're not going to assimilate to the laws, they're not going to assimilate to the culture. They're setting up their so-called no-go zones where they practice extreme forms of their religion, and they're trying to, of course, press that religion upon us. They also, on the fringe right, warn that the natives of that country are being replaced, leading to them becoming second-class citizens in what they call their own country, right? But that, of course, comes from the far right, works with the far right. Now, most Americans, and I'd like to believe, and I'm pretty sure most Europeans don't think that way. But we are all people here, and people can be afraid, and they can be scared into supporting draconian immigration policies if they're convinced that it would lead to terrorist attacks. Now, is that true? Well, okay, so there is some truth in that looser immigration laws do lead to more terrorism, right? And you have to look at the numbers, right? And you have to look at what's going on. Now, the thing is, the caveat, right, is that it's not the migrants, not the people who are coming in from those other countries that are actually doing the terror. It is actually a response from the far right. So now, as Richard J. McAlexander, who's a political science PhD candidate at Columbia, he recently wrote a Washington Post op-ed. So now he talked about this, and he basically said that immigrants are not the ones committing terrorism in Western Europe. So he basically focused a lot on Western Europe, which, to be honest, of course, that's where Donald Trump gets a lot of his rhetoric, right? From far right, nationalists in some of these European countries. So now he says native citizens appear to be committing terrorism because of hostility to immigrants. So now that's interesting, right? Now, one of his examples, and I'm going to probably butcher the name here, and I apologize, but there was a conservative German politician who supported Angela Merkel and her pro-refugee policy. So this is a conservative, right? Conservatives, I think in Germany, or more like your centrist Democrats here in the United States, right? So they're not as conservative as conservatives here in the United States. So that's your context, right? But this is Walter Lubke, and he was fatally shot by a far-right terrorist. Now, that suspect had ties to neo-Nazis and other right-wing extremists. And back in 1992, that same suspect attacked and nearly killed an immigrant on his own. Now, this is one of the examples used by McAlexander in a study published in the Journal of Global Security Studies. So what he did is that he studied the relationship between immigration and terrorism over the past couple of decades in 8 Western European countries. Now, this would be Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and the UK. He found in this study that when immigration levels to a country increase, the total number of terrorist attacks increased in that country as well. But as he mentioned before, as the data shows, it is not the immigrants that are doing these terrorist attacks. It happens to be some of these natives of that country that are responding to these immigrants. So now he, knowing that, he also looked to see if there was a relationship between immigration and all forms of terrorism, or if the ideology of the terrorist matters. Is a Muslim, extremist, etc., right? And generally, that's what they look at. After looking at the data, he found that the association is only present when looking at terrorist attacks by right-wing groups and individuals. there was no association between immigration and other forms of terrorism, including left-wing terrorism and terrorism by separatist groups. So now, to be fair, and again, there will be conservatives that call foul on this. How dare you, right? So they looked in whether or not that this terror could be driven by economic anxiety. What are you talking about? They're coming in, they're taking our jobs, right? They're taking our jobs, they're taking our welfare. Economic anxiety, right? So now, did he find any evidence to connect those two things? Economic anxiety. It turns out, no. Just like with Donald Trump winning the 2016 election, the majority of people who support these kinds of politicians and also do right-wing terror attacks are not driven by economic anxiety. Nobody's killed or done a terrorist attack over somebody, basically killing their job, right? Or I should say taking their job. No, they found that immigration levels are closely associated with right-wing terrorism than measures related to the economy, such as GDP and the unemployment rate. Refugees, who are less likely to drive the competition for jobs, are also associated with right-wing terrorism. So in reality, from those two pieces of information, you can surmise that right-wing terrorism is not driven by economic anxiety, but actually by racial anxiety, racial and ethnic differences. Now, he also found, interestingly enough, this relationship is stronger when immigrants come from Muslim-majority countries. As if that, of course, that is a shock to anyone here. Right-wing terrorism does not rise when there is higher immigration from other European countries. So, again, if you're looking at, white European nations and white European migrants, right? Or when they go from, for example, the UK to Germany, Germany to the UK, Luxembourg to France, whatever, you don't necessarily have that increase in right-wing fear, right-wing terror. But if somebody is coming from, for example, Libya, right? We've seen that a lot. Libya to Germany, Libya to anywhere else within the European Union, then you start to have that increased fear and racial anxiety because, here are the Muslims that are they're coming in and they're going to try to change our society to be more like them. Now, that doesn't make sense to me. That argument never made sense because it's like, wait a minute, why would you make the country that you were fleeing from or that you're fleeing to like the country that you just fled from? That doesn't make any sense. You escaped that country because of the conditions there. You wouldn't want to recreate the conditions in the new country that you go to. So it doesn't make sense. It's not logical, right? It just, nobody thinks that way. But anyway, now right-wing terror, they also found, does not rise when there's a higher immigration. As I just mentioned that. Other research shows that individual support for far-right parties and policies also increases when someone has more resentment against immigrants. So that also shows that you are more likely, if you have a resentment or an anxiety against another race or religion, you are more likely to support conservative politicians and policies. So when you're afraid, you are more conservative. When you are not afraid, you tend to skew more liberal. So that basically shows that a lot of conservative policy, a lot of conservatives are there because they're afraid. There is some sort of underlying fear to their belief in these policies and in being a conservative. Now, that's fascinating. And I'm not saying that that's, true for every single one. Of course, as I mentioned before, tax cuts are a hell of a drug. Some people just love tax cuts and love deregulation. And they're like, well, I stand to make a lot of money if I'm a conservative and if I support conservative causes. So there you go. But look, all of this suggests, as I said, that right-wing terrorism is a reaction to an out-group, a group that is not of your own. So when all that data is examined, of course, you find that there's little evidence to support the claim that letting in more immigrants is letting in more terrorists. It's just not true. Furthermore, political rhetoric condemning immigrants may also potentially stoke violence. And again, I'm butchering this here. Lubke's assassination, the far right launched a torrent of online abuse and death threats, including one by his assassin in a YouTube comment attacking his pro-refugee policy. So, here's sort of the takeaway, right? Immigrants do not pose a security risk. Right-wing extremists who hate immigrants, they're the ones that are the security risks. They're the ones that increase the threat of terrorism in their respective countries. So now, back to America, right? So, look, in the U.S., we have a president right now who basically continues to fuel, terrible statements against Muslims, against, women of color, against black people, etc., right? That's the kind of president we have in the United States. He stokes racial resentment. Again, he told 4 women of color that they should leave America if they hate it. And of course, that's a false allegation because there's no evidence that they hate this country. They've never said, oh, no, we hate America. No, they're literally serving to help America, to actually make positive change in every American's life. Not just, Americans that look like them at the expense of, white America, as you should say, or as they say. No, they're trying to help everybody. College for all, right? Eliminating student loans. Healthcare for everybody. That's stuff that most Americans actually agree with. So what do you do to try to dissuade people from, actually believing in those policies or supporting people who support those policies? You bring up the issue of racial resentment. And look, here's the thing. This nativist rhetoric that, oh, these people, they're not from America, they hate America, they should go back to their crime-ridden, infested countries, or whatever, that leads to terrorism. In fact, just recently a police officer was quoted threatening one of these women in a now-deleted Facebook post. Not only that, but there's been a lot of discussion about how often they receive death threats because of a lot of this so-called racist resentment and fear-mongering from politicians who gain political power from stoking those fears. This is what they do. And once again, it's not immigrants that are the problem. No, we're a nation of immigrants. It's those who see them as the other and feel personally threatened and attacked by them just existing in this country. Unfortunately, in America and some places in Europe, you have politicians and pundits that feed that flame and then distance themselves when it threatens to burn the place down. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent progressive media.